who's here in the room. I can see that we're obviously gathered across many different lands. So whether you are coming to this event today from within so-called Canada, or if you are residing beyond Turtle Island at the moment, I can encourage us all collectively to think about the crisscrossing histories of Indigenous movement, settlement, and stewardship which shape the land under our feet. I will focus my own land story for a minute here today on the meeting place of Toronto, or Takaranto, where I currently am, but I hope it can be a model for your own reflections on where in the world you currently are standing. Shaping my land acknowledgement today is a quote from the Toronto Climate Action Network that, quote, "The purpose of land acknowledgements is to shake settlers out of their ignorance and generate a more truthful account of history. Land acknowledgements help settlers recognize that history on this land began long before 1867, and that present-day Canada is a settler colonial state made possible through dispossession and violence." It has been widely criticized that many scripted acknowledgements erase the truth about land dispossession. For example, in our home institution at the University of Toronto, the official acknowledgement does not mention that the initial Toronto Purchase process, which occurred in 1787 between the Mississaugas of the Credit and the British Governor General, was illegitimate. The land deed from the 1787 meeting was rediscovered a few years later and found to be entirely blank. Even further, the signatures of the chiefs present at the so-called sale had been written on separate pieces of paper, which were affixed to the blank deed. It's important to recognize these truths as they reflect a very long history of European settlers stealing Indigenous land and title through disrespectful and violent methods that violate treaty. Later on in 1805, the Toronto Purchase deal was reinstigated by the settler government in an attempt to confirm settlers' land rights. And with this finalized deal, the Crown expropriated approximately 250,000 acres of land from the Mississaugas for 10 shillings. The name for the Toronto Purchase tries to erase Indigenous existence and resilience on this land by suggesting that the lands were purchased and Indigenous titles subsequently extinguished, but this is not the case. Having reflected on these processes of dispossession, only a few of the many, by which settlers came to this land, I want to acknowledge that we are holding our discussion today on land that has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples for more than 15,000 years and continues to be inhabited today. It is the territory of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and any other nations, recorded or unrecorded, who have cared for this land since time immemorial. Today, the territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, and Mississaugas to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Europeans and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And I'm hoping that this treaty of friendship and respect can be our guiding framework for the space we create together today through this panel. Thank you, and I'll hand it back to Alexandra to introduce our first speaker.
Thanks so much, Grace. So I'm going to briefly contextualize the panel and then hand it over to our wonderful speakers. I want you to know that we're very, very excited to be here today. This event is the brainchild of Grace and of Caroline Holland, who's with us today as well. Caroline is a PhD candidate in the English department who's completing a dissertation on pastoral urbanism in Cold War US literature. And Caroline was the co-convener of our group for the last several years. Together, Caroline and Grace conceived of this event. They sought out our excellent speakers. They managed the complications, which many of you are familiar with, of rescheduling a panel in the midst of a pandemic. We're here today because of their efforts, so many thanks to you both. We're gathered this afternoon to talk about questions which environmental humanities, which as we know has a particularly intimate relationship between theory and praxis, has for many years been asking. And one way to think about that question is, are the lectern and the monograph enough? What exactly is the value of teaching and of environmental humanities research in the absence of environmental justice? Very often, a very real sympathy for environmental justice comes to stand in for action in our field. And so some of the questions that we'll be thinking about today, most of them will not be new to you. How do academics become activists, and vice versa? What does an activist classroom look like? How can we avoid reifying activism? How can we sidestep a simplistic idealization and that binary we're familiar with that declares that all community work is political and essential and all scholarship is, apolitical and extraneous to a burning planet? What exactly are the barriers which exclude community organizers from entering the scholarly spaces that we occupy, like the one we're occupying right now? How can we remediate and intervene in the overwhelming whiteness of faculty and meet in connection with environmental justice communities, which are much more racially diverse? And what about the labor of activism? How is that manageable in the increasingly 24/7 endless workday of the neoliberal university? At a concrete level, it can be, as we know, difficult to learn and to know how to work differently, how to think differently, how to move beyond the methodologies that we were taught. So Grace and Caroline brought us together for this afternoon, both to think through these questions and to offer some models for engagement, potential roads forward, with a few road signs, I hope, guiding us through for what many of us is still a much desired and yet untraveled terrain. So it's my great pleasure to begin by introducing our first speaker. Dr. Deborah McGregor, who holds a Canada Research Chair, is cross-appointed at Osgoode Hall Law School, as well as the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University. Her work is at the forefront of Indigenous environmental justice and Indigenous research, theory, and practice. You can find her scholarship on the IEJ Project website and the UKRI International Collaboration on Indigenous Research. Dr. McGregor has made particularly creative use of digital and social media in her work, and we're very grateful indeed to welcome her here today. So Dr. McGregor, over to you with our thanks.
Thank you for persisting despite everything. Back in March, people thought, oh, we'll just reschedule for the fall in person, and then, other kind of things. We all got those disturbing emails. Nope, nothing's going to happen. And thank you for that land acknowledgement. I'm just on someone's committee, and her whole, she's linking planning and land acknowledgements and how you need to think about them. She'll release the podcast, they're amazing, and how you need, and everyone should write their own, basically, is what she says. How are you connecting? What do you learn? What do you still need to learn? So yeah, I really appreciated just really kind of going into depth there and understanding the history in order to understand the present. So so it was good to read her reflection this morning and then hear that land acknowledgement. So so thank you for that. So, and that introduction, I'm thinking, not sure if I can live up to all of that, but we'll try my best to see how to see what I can convey. So for my presentation, I just really wanted to kind of share remarks, I think, about how I think about the work I do in relation to the questions. I think throughout my work, I've always, well, I think part of the problem with trying to link theory and practice is we often don't actually really kind of know what they mean. I think in the academy, we just use these words, we say words like ontology, we say words like theory, but we actually don't really think about what they actually really mean. And when that kind of hit me head on was, and we're reading stuff and we're writing about it, but then how do you kind of explain it to other people, like really out there in the real world, because it's very easy to become a theory head. And it was when my son, he was in grade 6 in the TDSB. The curriculum's changed, but in grade 6 they're learning, I guess they were learning the Bering Strait theory. But they're trying to incorporate Indigenous curriculum into the public school education. And their assignment was, they were given the Anishinaabeg, I think it was the recreation story actually, and the Bering Strait theory. And their assignment in grade 6 was which one's true. And so after flipping out, and he's always gets kind of scared to bring these assignments home. So, then he has to deal with crazy mom. She flips out about this kind of thing. So I started telling him, like, well, there's different theories around how this happened, and Bering Strait is just like one theory. There's these other theories, other ideas, like now finally coming to the fore. And around if there was a migration, actually came from the south. Maybe some people came that way, but not everyone. And so there's all these different theories about how this happened. And, you know, as I'm trying to help him kind of work through this, and again, it tells you also, in our work, we have to ask the right questions. If you don't know, like, which one is true isn't really a good way to kind of explore them. So we always have to kind of ask ourselves and ask the right questions in our research and even in our teaching. And in this case, so my 11-year-old says, so what's theory? And I was stumped. I mean, I was teaching an Indigenous research course where I'm teaching theory and how you have to theoretically frame your, you know, your proposals. And I'm like, so having to explain it to someone who was in grade 11 made me think through, okay, what do I actually mean by this? And do I actually agree with the conventional kind of idea about what people understand theory to be? And is it really that separated from practice? And what I realized in him forcing me to think through this is that universities, you know, kind of in the world of education, universities are more theoretical and colleges are more practical and applied. And universities are above colleges. Like, there's this hierarchy of how we think, right? So, so part of it was trying to break that down in some of my own work. And I am going to go somewhere with this. And so I think about theory and practice as actually being part of the same whole, almost like, you know, what a snail's kind of back looks like one, like they're actually inseparable. Like, they're actually part of the same thing. And I get this from an Anishinaabe way of thinking. Like, there's no point in knowing if you actually don't act on that. Like, then there's know, and then there's knowing. So they become, so that's sort of theoretically, I guess you could say, and practically and applied in an activist orientation, how I approach the work is that, and this came from elders, and some of the work I was doing on water justice in Ontario was, after we did the work, we talked to elders, we were inputting into the Walkerton inquiry, and we're just like, whew, like we often do at our project, and when you're done your PhD, you'll do the same thing, whew, oh, that's done, you know, light at the end of the tunnel, I'm done. But we weren't off the hook. That was just the beginning. They just said, so what are you going to do about this? What are you going to do about this knowledge? What are you going to do about everything that we told you? We were totally not off. It was just the beginning. And 20 years later, here I am still doing water justice work because they just said, you're not. Like, there's knowledge and how we produce it, and then there's knowing, and knowing is the verb. Knowing's the verb part of it. Now you're gonna figure out and work on acting on that kind of knowledge. So that's sort of how Anishinaabe theory kind of works. So how I apply that in, so a lot of it's embedded within language. So how does that work in the Indigenous environmental justice work that I did? So before I went to York, I was actually at U of T in geography and Indigenous studies. Cross-appointed. And when I applied to do a Canada Research Chair, it was mostly because I wanted to actually get to do some research, because I was teaching in an undergraduate program that didn't have graduate program. I was supporting other people's research and doing a lot of teaching, and I thought, what is it like to actually be an academic and have time to do research? But I didn't know what Indigenous environmental justice was, like the field of it, even though it was kind of what I was doing. And so I had to learn what that was. Like, what is Indigenous environmental justice? When I applied for this Canada Research Chair, I was able to make the case because I got the job somehow. And so what I found about the Indigenous environmental justice theory, although way more so than other kind of, it actually emerged from a movement, like this reality that was happening in the United States. And then people tried to figure out, how do we name it? What do we call it? What do we call these spatial, you know, disproportionate impacts on people? And so it was kind of existing, and people trying to name it. But the field itself was being applied. It wasn't developed from Indigenous peoples' worldview or epistemologies or ontology, which are just fancy words for saying what we consider to be real and how we know it, like how we know what's real or not real. And like many disciplines, the theoretical frameworks and the methods and the questions would then be applied in an Indigenous context. And that's not wrong, you know, because there really wasn't like a discipline to kind of like understand the real lived reality of what people were experiencing, right? So, so this whole field of Indigenous environmental justice kind of gets gets generated. So it's actually like from the 1980s. It's not that old, even though it's kind of drawing on other theories. And so I found that it really wasn't adequate, although it's important. I would never say it's not. It's sort of like, this is Indigenous environmental justice thinking, theory, movement, and it's important. It absolutely is, because it's made change and it's named things and it's, you know, called out people who perpetuate injustice. But it really wasn't capturing what Indigenous peoples were experiencing, or the distinctness, particularly in North America, because there's a particular, you know, relationship with the state. And so I approached it from the perspective of, okay, I want to know from Indigenous worldview, from the legal and knowledge and governance and language perspective, how we understand this concept. So does it even make any sense in an Indigenous way of thinking and how we understand theory? So that's how I approached it. So if you approached it from, and then what can that contribution be to the whole field? And so I did that. That's essentially what I did in the research. And a lot of Indigenous way of approaching Indigenous environmental justice is very contrary to what people might see in the media. So we think Wet'suwet'en, we think Dakota Access Pipeline, what we might be seeing on the tweet, like that, you know, those kind of movements, or I don't know more. But really, mostly what it was when we actually, you know, talk to elders and youth and others, is it's actually enacting and living in appropriate relations with the natural world. That's actually what it is from an Indigenous perspective. And that justice applies to all beings and not just people. Like, as an Indigenous environmental justice field tends to focus on imbalance and empower relations between people, which is absolutely important. No one would say that's not important. But Indigenous perspectives always goes beyond people. It goes into the non-human realm, and it included that. But a lot of the Western theoretical ideas don't deal with that very well. So what do you do about that, even if you know it? But Indigenous peoples do know. They already know how to do that. And so part of the work then tried to be like, how do we bring this forward? What can it contribute to these big questions of the day for justice and climate justice and other realms? So that became like sort of where I went with that. And I'll finish soon, so we make sure there's time for everybody. And so part of the way that I approach the scholarship is, typically people will get funding. You know, they'll do their project and then they'll start like generating knowledge, producing knowledge that goes into publications, that goes to conferences, like the usual metrics that are going to count towards people either getting tenure or even getting a job, kind of in the first place, if that's, you know, the route they choose to take. And but I thought people can't wait. Like, my lived reality as an Anishinaabeg person is, this was an issue 500 years ago, centuries ago, decades ago, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and the next day. I can't wait. People can't wait all this time for the scholarship to generate the solution, right? So I approached the work to try to mobilize the knowledge at exactly the same time it was being produced. So I did that by having a gathering, which actually had the Justified Assure, because that's like connections grant. And I'm like, no, it's actually part of knowledge sharing right off the hop. And then we would generate products from that. If people can't come, that was part of equity and justice. Not everyone can come. Not everyone can come to Toronto. It costs money. There's accessibility, you know. So almost everything that we do has been generated, has been to try to generate at the same time and produce, as we're producing the knowledge, to try to convey it in forms that's going to work for people. I'll admit I'm the least creative person that you're ever going to meet. I'm not good at anything multimedia. I'm a terrible artist. So I totally rely on students and what they do to try to generate that. And we're expanding our I guess, horizons and scope for what that looks like. And you'll see that on the website. Just recently this summer, I just hired some Indigenous students and communities, because there was major travel restrictions, period. But in Indigenous communities, you can't go there. Like, I can't go see my mom in my community until I get a COVID test that's negative, and then I can go see her, which I wouldn't do anyway in order for me to get past the checkpoint. So it was like, okay, what are people in communities doing? What are youth doing COVID-19? How are they connecting with their knowledge, language, elders, and the land? And they could produce whatever they wanted. And I had to accommodate that. Mind you, I had like, okay, the students did, not me. I supported them to be able to do it. Here's what they produced. Try to make it work on the project, and you'll see some of the work that they did. And we're going to have to do a better job to try to capture more what they did, so they could tell their story. So I wasn't generating the story. Other people were generating that story through the means and the privilege that I have in the academy. So that's a significant approach that I take. Later on, maybe doing Q&A, I can talk about, okay, how does that translate into what we might call activism, or what we might call, what people will, hopefully that narrative's changing from protester to being protector, because that's a completely different way of thinking about how you do this work and how you approach it. Like, language and meaning is everything. But I'll stop there because I'm really super keen to hear everybody else. Like, I'm really fascinated by all of this, and I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot. And I might forget to mention this, is the work of Kyle White. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. So Kyle White, formerly at Michigan State University, Potawatomi scholar, activist in the humanities. His PhD's in philosophy, or he was in philosophy. Now he's gone to the University of Michigan because he wants to do more activist kind of work, because he was feeling a little bit constrained where he was in the humanities. But to me, he's probably one of those kind of people where I just go, you're a philosopher and I understand what you're saying. Like, he could talk like a human to like humans. And the work was all meant to be like, to have, was very practical and policy oriented. So I found he was really able to achieve that from a humanities perspective. So I would say, look at his work. He publishes a lot, and he talks like a human. So, because I've seen people go into Indigenous communities, and I'm like, I have no idea what you're saying, but apparently you're talking about me, and I don't understand a word that you just said. So being able to communicate is like really, really important. But I'm going to stop there because I'm really super keen to hear other people. So hopefully there was some food for thought in my remarks. So thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you so much for that. Well, that was really interesting. I think we're going to have a lot of questions. And I should say that we're going to, positive questions. We're going to hold questions until the end. So we're going to go on and hear from our next panel member now. And then we'll have questions when everyone's had a chance to talk. So our next guest is Jennifer Baker. Dr. Baker received her doctorate in English Literature and Canadian Studies from the University of Ottawa just last year, where she completed a SSHRC-funded dissertation that has a great title. And that title is Like a Virgil, Georgic Ontologies of Agrarian Work in Canadian Literature. Dr. Baker is currently the National Administrative and Communications Coordinator for the Sierra Club Canada Foundation, a part-time professor at the University of Ottawa, as well as a poet. Dr. Baker's first chapbook, Abject Lessons, was published in 2014 and has since been accompanied by many more publications. So Dr. Baker, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Alexandra and Grace and Caroline, for having me participate today. I'm really excited about this panel, and I've already been really inspired by Deborah. A lot of what she said really resonated with me. And even in her sort of talk about land acknowledgements, she was talking about like the intersection between planning and land acknowledgements, which made me think a lot about Ottawa as sort of the capital of so-called Canada, being on unceded Algonquin territory, but also ongoing violence of Ottawa's sort of continued development of that land, including sort of most recently in the Kitigan-Zibi development, which is a highly contested space and a sacred site for the Algonquin people. And that's a very recent act of colonial violence that is ongoing. So thank you for that. So I'm actually sort of have some news in that I'm not currently the National Administrative and Communications Coordinator for the Sierra Club Canada Foundation. I'm actually now a board member. So I'm a director at large of the foundation as of last week. So it's a really recent development. And I can't speak to that work because we've only had one meeting, but I am really excited to sort of take what I learned as the administrative and communications coordinator and apply it to basically the governance of that foundation. So I'll speak mostly to my experiences today as that coordinator, but I also have experience prior to that in an anti-poverty group. So I worked for Ottawa Acorn for a couple of years. I did a lot of door knocking, making calls and fundraising to help build power by increasing membership in the organization that helps lower income people in Ottawa advocate for their rights municipally, provincially, and federally, including issues like housing, disability supports, and financial sector regulation. All of which I often brought to bear on environmental issues if I was talking to someone who was particularly interested in environmental activism. And before that, inside the Academy, I was also a steward for QB 2626, which is our GA union when I was a grad student. And I was sort of deeply involved in departmental graduate students associations. So I think because of my history of my involvement in community building in both spaces, I don't really think of the collective organizing as being necessarily opposed to the individualized structures of the university. I see them as really interconnected. Or rather, I think a more accurate way of saying this is I tend to see what we call individualized structures as actually collective structures in disguise. So we're often told something is individual labor, but it's actually almost always collective, and we're just told to ignore that part. And usually that's I think overstated because of neoliberal university structures and the scarcity of jobs. We're kind of thrown into competition with each other, where knowledge making is actually a collective practice in all ways. In our citation practices, in our writing practices, it's all been collaborative labor in my experience. And so I think that sort of Deborah's assessment of Anishinaabe theory resonated with me a lot because of that idea that theory is sort of the thing that undercuts all action, and it is action. They're not extricable from each other. And the way that we think about the world tends to be the way that we act. So you either act in accordance with an acknowledgement of your relationship with the non-human world, or you act in an extractive relationship with that world and a destructive relationship, depending on, sort of the theory that you've absorbed in your life and experiences. And so that was part of what my scholarship was sort of addressing from the perspective of a settler who was trying to find her way back through that history in terms of agriculture. And I also knew that joke title was going to follow me everywhere. I was warned, but I still like it. So I think that in terms of like sufficient scholarship, we do our work in the midst of ongoing, complex, and intersecting crises, both within the university and outside the university in terms of climate change, crises of ongoing colonization, and racism. And I think that these ongoing and intersecting crises that disproportionately affect Black and Indigenous people, in that context, there's never really going to be sufficient action. I think our work requires an ongoing engagement with these crises because we're not going to solve climate change. I hear that a lot, that we're just going to solve climate change. It's not a puzzle to be solved, it's a damage to be mitigated. And it's an ongoing process. Just as collective action that's accountable to itself requires an ongoing engagement with the often sort of intersecting, complex, and sometimes contradictory needs of a large and diverse group of people. And so I think that in terms of scholarship, to say that anything is going to be sufficient scholarship sort of goes against the way that knowledge building works, and also the way that activism works toward these ongoing negotiations. So having said that, my experience sort of outside the environmental humanities discipline and in the environmental sector, so I'm working in the charity sector in Canada, which is a much more institutionalized form of activism, we might say. It is guided by legislation. There are certain things we can and can't say publicly, and we're sort of limited in some ways by a charity status, right? So we can't really act outside of that legislation and still continue to hold the kinds of power that we do hold. And so I often struggle with the systems within which we do our work and the value of doing that work within those systems. So one example I can think of is that it can be really helpful to have an audience that places their idea or places their trust in institutions. So there is a certain demographic of people who are interested in environmental issues that tend to trust information coming from certain institutions rather than from what we might think of as activist spaces. And so you basically have an audience to bring to bear the things that we take for granted in environmental humanities as common knowledge. So one of those things I often think about in Sierra Club is conservationism. So we have, you know, a membership that largely, and I think this is largely true of a lot of white settler environmentalists, think of environmentalism mostly as conservationism and have not come to terms with their racist and colonialist histories of that movement as a philosophy. And so what can be useful is being able to communicate compassionately with people about that history, and then ask them to imagine what it would be like if we had more equitable ways of collaborating with other activists, with Indigenous activists who have been doing that work for a lot longer than any of us have. So it's like a constant negotiation with people's feelings that say they've been doing this work since the 70s, but they've always been doing it in conservationist areas, and they've always been thinking about it as conservation, or they've been thinking about it as science-based in terms of Western science-based. Part of what this sort of ongoing work that I attempt to do is communicate sort of those histories and the problems with the history of those movements in such a way that can help bring people sort of more in line with being able to listen to other people. And so that's sort of one thing that I found most jarring when I left academia, was that there are very real and very powerful emotional reactions to explaining these histories. And people need a lot of time, and you need a lot of patience to be able to address those issues compassionately. I know Sierra Club US just had sort of this come up when they released a blog post about John Muir and John Muir's racist history. So it brought them more in line with their allies, but it also really hurt a lot of people who had never been told this before or had never come across it before, because a lot of the scholarship or things that they about John Muir are just sort of uncomplicatedly celebratory. And so I think that's one of the ways that scholarship kind of clashes with sort of these spaces, is that we as environmental humanities scholars are usually asked to do the internal work of being aware of or becoming aware of our own biases and our own subject positions in ways that most people are not asked to do in their daily lives, and not asked to do in an ongoing way. And so I do think it's valuable to be able to bring that to bear in the sort of charity sector and in that context, because the environmental charity sector is still very white. In terms of like the institutions and the organizations, like by and large, it's still very, very white. And I think one of the reasons for that is because there is this idea, this very entrenched idea of conservationism that is alienating to pretty much everybody else. And so we might sort of use our theory to try to get people to think about and imagine more equitable, more humble, and more sustainable ways of living. So one of the other lessons I've learned, and I'll concentrate just on working within sort of these institutionalized ways of doing activism, because they ran me really quickly and really painfully into the kinds of negotiations that happen in government around civil society. So one of the biggest lessons I learned working in the charity sector is that we're often sort of not used to, and we're often turned off by the kinds of pragmatic ways of thinking about collaboration that you need to do to create systems change on a large scale. And we talk a lot about systems, and we talk a lot about the power that systems have and the entrenched inequalities that they create, but we rarely take the time to really think about how they work. Like, we don't get into the weeds when we're talking about environmental humanities as much. And part of what happens is that we end up talking to people. For example, I was consulting on the Canada-European Trade Agreement, CETA, last year. And one of the experiences I had was I was talking to people who worked in the government, in the public service. And if you think academia is siloed in terms of disciplines, the public service is you just running into talking to people about large, complex problems that they just don't have the power to solve because the government works in terms of strict disciplinary silos. And so you may have convinced one person that there needs to be change, but they have no idea how to create that change because they don't know how to transcend the structure in which they're trying to create that change. So I don't have a solution to that, but it is one of the sort of brick walls that I noticed almost immediately when I started talking to people working in civil society and people who are working in the public service, trying to create change, that it is really a system built against fast change. It's built against rapid transformation. And so I still find that incredibly alienating and overwhelming, if I'm honest, trying to negotiate those spaces. So I think I'll just say another sort of quick flash is that one of the things that I've also learned is that sort of when you're transcending or working outside academia with a PhD, you kind of learn very quickly that your PhD doesn't mean very much when you're talking to activists who are already doing the work. So it reminds me of what Deborah said again, was that doing the work is learning the work. So you can start with a PhD, you can have, say, worked 9 years on a PhD and know what you know, and still you're constantly starting at the beginning and relearning where your theory and where your ideas and where that knowledge you've created actually fits when it comes to creating systems change. So I found that with my PhD, a lot of what I did was, I still feel like I did some important work, but I also did really important work for myself in terms of situating myself in a place where I had an idea of where I wanted to imagine us ending up. So a lot of that work ended up being internal work. And I think that is very important, but it is important to keep in mind that the work that you do in academia is really a starting point rather than an end point for activist work. So I'll stop there and thank you again.
Jennifer, thank you so much. We're going to go to our final panelists before we open this up for conversation and questions. And we're lucky to have with us today Ashley Caranto-Morford, who is a Panay British scholar activist, whose work is accountable to and in relationship with Filipinx and Indigenous studies, as well as with anti-colonial methods and digital humanities. Both Ashley's scholarly and community work strives to create space for settler Filipinx, Filipina, Filipinos in so-called Canada, in order to develop an understanding of just what responsible and respectful solidarity against settler colonialism and in support of Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty might look like. To that end, Ashley is currently completing a SSHRC-funded doctoral thesis entitled Settler Filipinx Kinship Work, Being Better Relations Within Turtle Island. Welcome, Ashley.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask if I can get permission to screen share. Okay, awesome.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. I won't need it till later, but I just want to make sure I asked beforehand. Kamusta, Akosi Ashley. Hi everyone, my name is Ashley. My pronouns are she, her. Firstly, many thanks, Mareming Salamet, to Grace for the invite to be part of this wonderful gathering and conversation, to all of the brilliant and generous speakers, and to everyone here in this digital space. It's truly an honor to be part of this. I feel honestly like I have way more questions than I do answers, but I'm learning so much from all of you, and that's really wonderful. I want to begin by recognizing my relationship with and to land, and recognizing specifically the lands that have nourished me and my relations, the lands that I am connected to. I've lived my entire life away from my ancestral lands and as a visitor on various Indigenous lands in colonially called North America, from Coast Salish territories in what is colonially known as Washington State and British Columbia, to Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Wendat land, the Dish with One Spoon territory, Dougarondo, colonially known as Toronto, Ontario. On my father's side, I'm British, with roots particularly in the Dover and Liverpool regions of England. On my mother's side, I'm diasporic Panay, Visayan, and Lusonian. My mother grew up in Manila. My Lola, her mom, is Visayan Cebuana, and my Lolo, her father, is Pangasinense, of those islands currently known as the Philippines. Positioning the self, as I just have, is a critical part of my practice. This act recognizes the subject positioning and lived experiences I bring with me into any and all work that I do. It makes transparent power dynamics that may be at work in my research, organizing, and writing. It recognizes the communities that I am accountable to in and beyond this work, and makes clearer what I do and do not have the ability to speak about authoritatively or from lived experiences. So I'm a PhD candidate in English at the University of Toronto. My work in the community, in the university, and in between is in relationship with Indigenous studies, critical race studies, Filipinx studies, anti-colonial pedagogical practices, and anti-colonial digital technologies and new media. As someone who's ACE, I've got my ACE flag behind me here. So I've helped facilitate educational workshops with the grassroots organization ACE Toronto to raise awareness about asexuality and the intersections of colonialism, racism, and ace phobia. I've participated in blockades, marches, tiny house builds, and art builds, alongside and in support of Indigenous land defenders, asserting their sovereignty and protecting their lands from the colonial corporate encroachment of oil and gas pipelines. I've participated in demonstrations against the Philippine government and the fascist Duterte regime, which is currently terrorizing and killing Filipinos and Indigenous peoples in the Philippines. I'm currently a co-facilitator of anti-racism workshops for the Filipino diaspora, working alongside Panay's Jovi Galit, Caitlin Rosari, and Carla Villanueva Danan, hosting monthly gatherings where Filipinos can learn more about settler colonialism in Canada and the US, and gain tools to help challenge and dismantle anti-Blackness and anti-Indigeneity in the Filipino community. I'm the co-facilitator of a movement called Pedagogy of the Digitally Oppressed with Kush Patel and Arun Jacob. And we try to foster a community-focused, ethical, anti-colonial digital humanities collective and practice that pushes against the confines of the mainstream university system. I'm also a co-facilitator alongside Sosen Igbu, Shanna Peltier, and Caitlin Rosari of a working group housed at the Jackman Humanities Institute, focused on Black, Indigenous, and people of color solidarities, which strives to bring theory and practice together, asking what does it mean to bring academic theorizations, concrete grassroots organizing, and community building into active, lasting relationships in meaningful material ways. So last year, the working group hosted fundraisers in support of Unistoten, and this summer we raised funds for a series of Black community organizations. As was said, I'm currently completing writing a dissertation on Indigenous settler Filipinx Sao solidarities and kinship relations in colonially called Canada. And a core part of my thesis is autoethnographic. So that is, I share and reflect on my lived experiences, including the community work and organizing that I've been part of, because lived experiences, they're some of the most powerful knowledge. My organizing and educating work shapes this writing, and in turn, this writing shapes my organizing and educating work. So that idea of learning different theories and then embodying and practicing these theories in organizing work on the ground, seeing how they play out on the ground, how they fall short, and then engaging with other theories that may help to fill in the gaps on the ground that I and others have noticed. That word that often gets called activism, or those actions that often get defined as activism, I view as responsibility. I view fighting for human rights to be honored, fighting for the land to be protected and honored, fighting to end white supremacy. I view all of these as responsibilities. As a settler and treaty person in these lands, I have the responsibility to know whose lands I'm living in, those histories and ongoing relationships that Indigenous peoples have always had with these lands, to honor the treaties of those lands, to know and honor the Indigenous laws of those lands, which have existed since time immemorial, and to treat these lands that nourish me and that have nourished Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples have been caring for since time immemorial. I have a responsibility to take care of these lands and to be a good relation in these lands. As a diasporic Panay, I have a responsibility to know what is going on within and to be accountable to my homelands. And I believe we as human beings have a responsibility to respect the animals, the plants, the land, and our fellow human beings. So as Métis artist Christy Belcourt has said, we humans are at the bottom of the food chain. We need everything and nothing needs us to survive. And as Anishinaabe artist Bonnie Devine says, the land and water are our lifeblood, our kin, our lungs and heart. There's a Filipino Tagalog principle, kapwa. It roughly translates to the self in the other. And I understand that to mean that we are all related. We're all connected, we are all one. So that is, we cannot act for individualistic reasons, but always must be thinking about others, the collective. We all have a responsibility to one another, and it's not just humans that are connected, it's all of the universe that is connected. So that means that I have a responsibility to care for my fellow humans, to care for my animal kin, to care for the plants, the lands, the waters. So again, that which is so often labeled as activist, I view as responsibility. Now, as someone in an English department, I'm often asked why study literature? What is the point, especially while the planet burns? And my response is that literatures can be vital. I think about Cherokee scholar and writer Thomas King's words in his Massey lecture, The Truth About Stories, where he says, the truth about stories is that that's all we are. And I believe that absolutely, fully, with every part of me. The society that we live in, Canada as a regime, has been shaped by a particular story. It's the settler colonial story, the one that says that this territory is legitimately Canada when, in reality, it's colonially occupied Indigenous land. It's the white supremacist story that erects statues of genocidal human traffickers and land stealers and suggests that taking these statues down is to erase history. It's the capitalist story that tells us that the land is not a living kin, but rather a resource to be owned, extracted, and taken from. It's a story that places humans, and especially white, cisgender, heterosexual, financially well-off, and able-bodied men, above all else, as the highest in some fallacious hierarchical chain. And that situates humans, and specifically white settlers, as having dominion over and right to this land, and right to divide the land and have control over nature, dig it, drill it, mine it, and profit off of it. That is a story that has been violently imposed and that has been told so many times in so many pervasive ways that it has been largely naturalized within mainstream psyches. And so as I think about that, I'm reminded of Daniel Heath Justice, another Cherokee scholar. In his book, Why Indigenous Literatures Matter, he asserts that stories can be bad medicine. And as I hope I've just demonstrated, colonial capitalist stories, they are bad medicine. But then Daniel Heath Justice emphasizes too that stories can be good medicine. And that's what I think Black, Indigenous, and many people of color stories are. They are good medicine that can guide us to better understand our responsibilities and to be better in this world. I think these stories have so much healing and good world-making power. I believe that these stories provide alternatives to colonialism through recognizing and telling the ongoing histories of Black, Indigenous, and people of color resistances to colonialism. These stories are filled with ancestral ongoing knowledges. Black, Indigenous, and people of color ancestors know, and so those of us who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color know too, that there are ways of life beyond colonialism, that we can create a world where everyone can thrive, human and non-human, a world that is not colonial or capitalist. Black, Indigenous, and many people of color stories tell us that. And so when we talk about the planet burning, if we turn to Indigenous stories, if we turn to Black stories, if we turn to people of color stories, they can teach us how to do better. They can teach us how to be better relations to and with the land and to others, to animals and plants and our fellow human relations too. Stories are central to everyone and to the entire world. And so to end, I'm going to share my screen for a moment. Oh, it says that I still cannot.
Okay, Ashley, give it a try again.
Great, I got it this time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Wonderful. Okay, so to end, I'm sharing my screen. I view the work that I do, the writing that I do, in community, in the university, and in between as deeply collaborative, as multi-authored, guided by my ancestors, deeply in relationship with the teachings from the Black, Indigenous, and people of color, whose work I cite, and then done within and nourished by various caring and supportive communities. I wouldn't be where I am. I wouldn't be able to do what I do, and I don't think I would have made it this far through doctoral studies without being surrounded by and uplifted by the communities of care that I am so grateful and privileged to be part of. Diasporic Filipina Jana L. Umapig calls on us to name our teachers as an act of recognition that we are here because of the support, love, and resilience of others. There are so many communities and people to whom I extend my sincerest thanks, Maraming Salamat po, some of whom do not know me personally. And I end by recognizing some of those people. They are writing beautiful, transformative, world-nourishing stories, and I'm grateful for the ways in which their stories have shaped me, and grateful and humbled too, to be a part of many of their stories, if even in the smallest of ways. So thank you, I'll end it there for now. And I apologize, my bunny, you might have heard in the background, she's tossing, she's got like a little tunnel, and she started tossing it when I started talking. So if you heard her, her name is Lou, and she says hi.
Thank you, Ashley. Whenever I hear you speak, I'm just reminded of how much power you have in your words. So thank you so much for walking us through that story, and really like the image of the snail and the shell that Deborah brought up at the start of our discussion came through to me in your talking about autoethnography and how community research is your work. I'm gonna pretty much open up the floor to all of our participants. I have some questions loaded in my doc if we need to use them, but I'm sure that everyone has been like writing down lots of thoughts while we had those 3 presentations. So if you want to ask a question, I suggest that we use this, the raise hand function on Zoom, which I've never used before, but Alexandra tells me that it shows who asks a question first and second and third, which is great. And we might prioritize people based on if they've asked a question yet or not. So don't be hurt if your hand goes up and we come to you a second later. And questions can be addressed to an individual scholar or to the panel as a collective. And anyone who presented, feel free to jump in on any of the questions that get asked.
Tanya has her hand up. I'm not sure if you can see that, Grace. But...
Oh, you must, yeah. So I don't have control over that. So you can be the
okay.
The moderator.
I'm just going to text you the names. So Tanya is our first one. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody, for such thoughtful just descriptions of your work and where you're at in thinking about this topic. And I have a question that's directed to all of the panelists. But I guess I'm going to start by referring to Ashley's and Deborah's talks specifically. So I was really taken with your suggestion, Ashley, that the actions that people normally refer to as activism, you actually think about as responsibility, as kind of like our responsibility to live in good relation with the world around us. And I think Deborah said something similar when you talked about, now I'm forgetting exactly what words you said, but you said something about this work being ongoing and not just something that, you know, you just kind of show up to a community and then think of the work as being done, but it's actually the start of an ongoing process that you've been doing for decades now. And this reminded me, I was at a different talk not that long ago, where one of the speakers, featured speakers, was Rita Wong, who knows, I think, will be someone who is known to a lot of people who are here today, who is an Asian Canadian, Chinese Canadian poet who has been working both within her poetic practice and her personal practice in solidarity with anti-pipeline and water protecting work on BC. And somebody referred in that talk, somebody referred to her work as activism, and she bristled against that, and she said something similar to what you Ashley and Deborah both said today, that she doesn't like the word activism because it suggests kind of a, you know, sort of the figure of the activist we think of as this figure who shows up at a, you know, at a specific location or to a specific place of contestation, and then leaves when that moment of contestation is done. And I think she talked about her work both also very much in terms of a kind of responsibility to care for the place you live in. So I'm wondering, I do have a question behind all of this, is if what you all think of the label activist to begin with, is it a useful label for us? Or, I mean, do you think of yourselves as activists, or is that label useful to begin with?
Ashley, you can go ahead since you're fresh off your talk. I'll need to think about it a little bit. If that's okay with you. Are you okay with that?
For sure.
Okay. I don't want to like to say you're on the spot. Then...
no problem. It's something that I've thought about a lot. I know this is also going to differ from person to person as well. I think, yeah, it's a very loaded term because it gets wielded as a way to delegitimize sometimes the work that folks are doing to make the world better, to hold systems accountable, to change systems. I think about in the context of the Philippines. So this summer, for those who are not aware, Duterte passed the so-called anti-terror law, which is actually a terror law that labels the people he calls activists, labels them as terrorists. And so activists are the people in the Philippines who are defending their lands, the indigenous people defending their lands from corporate colonial encroachment, the people who are speaking out against and acting against the human rights violations of Duterte's regime. He's killed thousands and thousands of people in the Philippines since he came into power. These people get labeled activists by him, and as they're labeled activists, then they get labeled as terrorists, and according to the anti-terror law, can be arrested and criminalized without any kind of process. And so on the one hand, we see the way in which this term activist gets taken up and used to portray these people who are fighting for, again, what I see as the responsibilities to honor human rights, to honor the land. They get labeled as activists in a way that's supposed to delegitimize them by the Philippine government. But at the same time, this word activism has been so powerful, or activist as a label has been so powerful for so many people in the community, because it signifies that honoring of responsibility. To be labeled that means that you are honoring the responsibility of protecting human rights, of protecting ancestral lands. It's a question that I think is there's so many layers to it, and there are instances where it has been such a powerful identity term, but then instances where it's used to delegitimize. But I think too about the ways in which mainstream society, as you were talking about, Tanya, how mainstream society views activism. And so often activism, or to be an activist, gets limited to mass organizing, which is certainly very important and has played an important part in igniting change and systemic change and holding governments accountable for their wrongs. But I also think that what we call activism needs to be something that we embody in the small too, in the day-to-day. The values that we bring into mass organizing should also be values that we bring into day-to-day, intimate, one-on-one interactions too. And so that kind of, I guess that is something I'm thinking about too as I reflect on your question. Yeah, those are my initial thoughts.
It's a really good question, and I'm actually thinking, as I'm like me trying to meet the deadline, inside grant deadline for October 1st, that like language really matters. So like I'll use activist because, as Ashley pointed out, it's like people who take on the label and accept it, because they are constructs. They're all constructs, like all kinds of, like people can just say I'm an ally, and that means about 1,000 different things, and some I'm comfortable with, some I'm not. Same with activists. So people just say I'm activist, but they actually don't do anything. So to me, activist sort of implies movement, acting on something, like, because it's kind of in the word. But now that you've kind of asked the question that way, and listening to Ashley, I sort of think, usually I call the language test in the work I do, like go to fluent language speakers who don't think in English, they think, and just say, is there like a thing for this? Like, what is, does this actually mean anything to us? And then, and what does it mean then to, to be a protector? Like, to me, what we saw with Dakota Access Pipeline and more recent movements in Wet'suwet'en is that people were starting to switch the narrative, and that became really important for a couple of reasons. One of them was those activists, those protesters, those troublemakers are breaking the law. So there's all these other labels that get put on the term activist that the activists themselves haven't taken on, but they get kind of these labels, right? So therefore you get to dismiss them because they're not credible. And so the narrative started to switch in a more public way, even though I think it was always an undercurrent with a lot of people acting on their responsibilities and knowledge, and switched over to protector. And that's a huge difference for a couple of reasons. One is it's more aligned with responsibilities of having to act on your obligations to the natural world, or a treaty person, or being on the territory and benefiting from it. So there's all these reasons that may get people to act on their knowledge. And the other thing that is connotated with protector is everybody. It's everybody. So even if you're on the line, like you're there having violent things happen to you, you're doing this for like everybody. So the narrative, the story is we're not just doing this for us. This isn't just us acting up, you know, against the state. We're trying to protect the water for everybody and all life. And I think more people can kind of relate to that. It's harder to dismiss people when they're actually acting in your best interests. So I think, so we're starting to see a little bit of that shift, and I'm trying to be really careful in my language, and I just realized that I wasn't in my grant, that I actually should be saying maybe activist protector, because a lot of people do say activist, right? Because in some ways it aligns with Anishinaabe thinking, because part of how we think is there's always movement. Like there's always like movement. You act on something. You make the paper. Like if you go to our website, you'll see the podcast by Sylvia Plain, and it's really good because she talks about how do you put research in motion. Like there's always this idea of movement and motion in an Anishinaabe way of thinking. And so it kind of aligns, but it's not exactly the same. Like there's probably a Venn diagram, and there's some like, you know, common kind of area there, but it is very much tied to responsibility, and protecting water then becomes everybody's response. Why aren't we all interested in this? Everybody's affected by it, right? So thinking about that narrative kind of in that way, but that's the image most people come up with. Like until a couple of months ago, like even on our website, it was all sort of protest kind of activist type stuff, which is really important because they draw attention in the public's eye to something they could completely ignore. And people start to ask questions, like in the Wet'suwet'en case, we'll start to say things like, what is traditional government versus Indian Act government? Like they're asking themselves questions that they never thought about before. So they do bring to the attention things that need to be brought to everybody's attention, right? So to me, it's really important. But when we actually kind of did the research and asked, you know, a lot of elders, like, what is it that we do to resist and to enable our future survival? And it's like being on the land, learning language. It became all of those kind of things. And I went, oh, that's not automatically what people think of, but they're clearly they're protecting and they're acting, you know, but in a different way by learning language, using language. So it's a lot broader than I think the media kind of makes it, and we can't allow ourselves to be kind of boxed in by, you know, whatever people's stereotypes and versions of what that is. And just to comment a little bit on what Ashley said, the work that I think activists and human rights defenders, because that's the other word, right? Defenders, environment land defenders is really important. So a couple of recent reports that came out from in line with the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Indigenous peoples, they combined to do this report on basically the killing of land and environment and human rights defenders around the world, and which it's really chilling. So like their work is like really critically important, but there's got to be so many other actors involved as well. And even after Dakota Access Pipeline, I was, hopefully it comes out soon so I can refer you to it. I was a peer reviewer for a paper. And I didn't know this, because this part doesn't hit the media. Like we all like saw what we saw during, and it was very unreported in mainstream media. It was like social media and other kind of media that really brought the Dakota Access Pipeline story to us. Was a lot of the states in the United States are starting to pass laws that make gathering and protest illegal. Alberta's considering that. So that work that they're doing is getting the state to react, right? So it's still really important. But I think we do have to be really mindful of labels, and they may not be our concept of what it means, but you're always dealing with it. It's like racism. You're always dealing with other people's crap, I guess, in relation to what you're naming and what you're talking about. Yeah, I think that's all. It was such a good question, and brings up so many, but it's really kind of made me think about my own terminology and being very careful about that, and trying to be inclusive, because people do, like, they still, you know, they want to, and you want to respect that, because like people's lives are on the line a lot of the times when they're engaging in the work that they do. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, just to chime in there, it was an excellent question, and it made me realize that I've always been really uncomfortable with the label of activist because I don't feel like I fit that description at all. And in my mind, sort of activists are extroverts, and I am not an extrovert. I don't know what I would call myself rather than an activist, maybe an irritant. uh, I I've always had sort of trouble with the activist label because a lot of what I've done to sort of I've done because I needed a job. So I entered Acorn as a community organizer because I needed a job. I was doing a 9-year PhD, so I needed an income. And I also didn't want to gain that income by doing something that my heart wasn't in. So I thought if I was going to have to do extra work on top of my PhD, I wanted to do that in a community where I was learning things outside the university that were really valuable to use later. And it was the same with my first job with Sierra Club Canada Foundation. It was in my field. I wanted to learn about what people were doing to create systems change, how the NGO sort of sector worked. And so for me, that doesn't fit any of the ideas of activism. You know, even if I go to marches, I'm there and I'll be holding a sign, but I'm not loud. I feel like I'm not loud enough to be an activist. I'm just not an extroverted person. So, and I much prefer listening to people than talking, which I think there's an important sort of activist part that's an internal sort of activism where you're listening and trying to transform yourself as well as transforming the systems you're in. But it's a really good question, and I would say that I do have an ongoing discomfort with the label of activist, and I do take Deborah's point too that people self-identify in lots of different ways, and I really think the important part of what we do is the work. So whatever you're doing, if you're trying to fit into activism and you feel like I'm not an activist, it's still important you do the work in whatever way you can, because everybody has to be doing the work in order to create change. So in some ways it is limiting, and in some ways it is a way of targeting people. And it's a really great question, and a really troubling term in lots of ways.
Alexandra, maybe do you have anyone else on the speakers list there? If anyone has a question, now would be the time to point your little digital hands. Alexandra, I'm relying on you as well because I do not know what the...
We don't have anybody in the queue at the moment, but I really like what you were just all saying about how the term activist itself can kind of celebrate or reify the idea of solo action. And that brings me back to what Ashley was talking about, the idea, and what all three of you were talking about. So the kind of celebration of the one heroic figure as the sort of, like that great man theory of history we used to talk about, what makes social change. And I sometimes teach a class on American protest movements. And this is something that we talk about, right? The debate about, well, whose names get remembered and who gets to occupy that kind of public face of social change. And what that does to the responsibility for the rest of us with the sort of, her making heroes out of a very short list of famous names, as opposed to seeing the work that Deborah was talking about, which I think is fascinating, like language recovery and learning and cultural memory as a form of change and a cultural act. And it makes me think differently too. I wonder if you would have something to say about how that might relate, how that model, that very different model, might relate to the work that gets done in classrooms. Because that's much more in line with the kind of work we do in classrooms than, marching or occupying the public square. So I wonder if there might be a kind of crossover there, or a kind of meeting place for, the educational and cultural and intellectual work that many of us engage in, and the kind of work that you're talking about?
I can maybe get the ball rolling, but super keen to hear from others. Um, a good question. One of the things I do, and it really doesn't matter which class I'm teaching, and I guess I don't know, I guess I choose to look at it as being fortunate that I'm Anishinaabe and Great Lakes, and I'm Anishinaabe from the Great Lakes, and so I'm literally getting to work and teach and raise my family and everything else, and the kind of territories that I come from, and and in that way draw on that knowledge and experience. But as I mentioned before, or like maybe it wasn't here, but is that really in the 25 plus years that I've been teaching, I rarely ever teach Indigenous students when I was at U of T and when I was at York, right? So most of the people I'm trying to convey that sense of responsibility, because of the way that we teach is very one way, regurgitate the stuff, even if we're trying to be engaging and do other things. Really at the end of the day, you're going to evaluate people. There's going to be transcripts, and people have anxiety around this. So how do you get people to think and reflect and be responsible, and then not feel like that isn't real work? Or how's that going to be evaluated? Is it going to be fair? All those kind of things, right? So, and I really had to think through this when I went to a law school, because the stakes are super high, because students there are ranked against each other. We have to do this. I hate it. Everyone's smart. Everyone's an A student. That's how they got in there, right? But now you cannot be an A student anymore. You have to be a C, because we have these ranking, those stakes are very high. And how do you do this a lot easier in the Faculty of Environment and Urban Change, because we do we don't assign grades. It's pass fail and then a narrative that we write. So and that gives people a lot more freedom, and they're willing to take a lot more risks, right? So people need to be comfortable. So one of the things that I do, and I did this too when I was teaching at U of T, and quite frankly found the younger kids, or the younger ones, first year a lot better at it than as the older the people got, the more separated they seem to be from themselves. Like their embodied knowledge seems to be more separate, because we train people to do that, right? To separate out those things. So I always start off with a land acknowledgement and the creation stories of the territory, and get people to think about what they mean, because the creation and recreation stories are all about what our relationship is supposed to be. What's our conduct? What's the appropriate conduct in order to enable life to continue? In the Anishinaabe, there's a destruction, and the destruction happens because people aren't behaving properly. That's why. So we actually have in our history, there's a destruction because people aren't behaving properly, kind of like what we're seeing now. I call them like climate change stories. We already have them. And so people can start to think about that. Like there's stories that matter of this land, of where there was knowledge for thousands of years. I remind them that, there was knowledge here for thousands of years before anybody ever came. So we're going to draw on that in this class. So I had to carefully design the assignments, like trying to teach people initially to be self-reflective, which is really hard the older people get. I hate to say it, but teaching that at graduate is very different than first year, when they're 16, 17, 18 years old. They're a lot more honest about that, or they're more free in being able to answer that. So there's that kind of the self-reflective positionality, like Ashley spent a lot of time and necessarily so to explain that. And also talk about your teachers, whether they were theorists or it could have been grandma, like, right, so that they can start to learn to acknowledge other sources of knowledge. Like, why are you interested in law? Why are you interested in him? Why are you? And so actually that's kind of hard for people to do that. And I try to let people, like, even in law, they could do it in different, and I've had people do it. They could do it through video. They could do it through art. I've had artists who did animated art. I'm like, so cool, but they sometimes are not comfortable sharing that broadly. It could just be for me, because sometimes writing things down, left to right down the page is a very particular, it forces people to think in a very particular way, right? Like sometimes that's not the best way to tell your story. So that's kind of the first thing that I do. And that became very important in Indigenous studies when we first started teaching it at U of T. So I was there right from the beginning. because people wanted to study the Indians, the other. And I'm just like, that's not what we do here. It's always in relation to, you're going to learn about you and why you think the way you do about Indigenous people. And a lot of people, that's not what necessarily they're signing up for, right? They want to know about ceremonies and spirit, like, they don't want to pay their, what I call pay their dues and learn about themselves first. And then, so I have a series of assignments that students have to kind of work through. They have to, so we use the First Story app, developed initially by the late Rodney Babawash, and then Heather, and now John Johnson pretty well heads it up at U of T, and get them to go think about history in Toronto, like literally go outside the classroom and go do something and learn about this and how you feel about it. So trying to get people kind of out of the classroom and be self-reflective about that. And then the last assignment, which is the one that kind of freaks them out kind of towards the end of the course, is how are you going to take responsibility for what you know? And because that's core to how Anishinaabe people think anyway, and this is the territories that we're on, one of them anyway, like there's Haudenosaunee, but they're similar in that respect. So you know the land acknowledgement, you know something about the treaties, we know that we're going to be the ancestors, we're, of future generations. How are we going to be responsible? What are we going to leave? Like, how are you going to do this? And they have to kind of answer that in their last assignment, and then discuss it in class. But sometimes it's really quick, like 12, 13 weeks, people kind of go on this journey, and it's challenging for them to do it. A little bit trickier now, I find, in law, because we've made Indigenous courses kind of mandatory. They at least have to take one before they graduate. So now you have people, instead of people who wanted to be there, you have people who don't want to be there. So it's a little bit, you're managing that a little bit. But usually at the end, they're saying, I learned something. And I go, if nothing else, you learn about yourself, like, and what your own biases are, right? So that's sort of how I kind of approach that, if that's kind of making any sense. And I do that in all my classes because I tend to teach primarily in Indigenous courses. So people always want to go in, like I said, study the others, study the Indians. And I'm like, no, that's not what we're doing here. We're going to study in relation to, you need to know yourself, because you're going to see through that lens, just like I see through my Anishinaabe lens. Like I look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs and just go, that is so wrong. That should be a circle. So I'm applying my lens, right? So that's what they're doing. And I know that's what people are doing. So how do you get people to, I'm not trying to change people. I don't come in and just say, I want you to conform to what I think your worldview should be. I say, you should at least understand what it is. And nobody asks people like, have you ever been asked in your class, or ever asked your class, okay, explain your worldview to me? Like that blows people away. Like they're just like, what? Like you want me to what? Instead of like reading stuff about it. And so those are actually really hard for people to do. Explain your ontology. And they're like, So that's what I try to do. So you're trying to cover all this content, but at the same time, you're actually trying to train people to think and realize that the way that we've trained them up to law school or graduate school is a very particular way. And that's why I find the younger ones, like sometimes they'll say, so tell me about your relationship to environment. And I remember having students in graduate school, well, some of them dropped the course over that question. Because they said, well, what do you mean? Is it all theory? I'm like, no, I want to know what your relationship is. The younger ones, 17-year-olds, could say, it's kind of consumer oriented. They were so honest. They weren't trying to impress me. I just wanted honesty, right? So, yeah, so that's sort of how I think about the pedagogy. It's changing all the time because I always try to be relevant and what's the context that we're dealing with. But so to me, even though I know there's some criticisms of the land acknowledgement, I start with that because they need to know whose land they're on. They need to know that universities are benefiting from the exploitation of Indigenous lands because they're publicly funded, and they need to know that they are benefiting and that they have some obligations in that respect. Yeah, so it's a lot of hard work, and people have to be, it has to be a safe place. For people to want to share that much of themselves. Yeah, so that was kind of long-winded, took up way too much time, but hopefully that was helpful for other folks in terms of how to kind of help students work through that. And I work through it with them as well. I didn't never ask students to do anything I wouldn't do myself, so.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add other than to say that I do something similar. One of my friends, Smokey Sumac, who's a Tanaha scholar, what he does that I like always really hold close. If we read a book together, or if we watch something together, he'll say, "What are you going to do from here? Now that you've seen this, now that you've heard this, now that you've witnessed this, what are you going to do from here?" And similar to that question and that teaching, in our assignments and in our discussions in class, I ask students, okay, so what teaching are you carrying with you? And how will you carry that teaching from your own positioning? Or what are your responsibilities? How have you come to understand your responsibilities from your own positioning, and how are you going to honor those responsibilities? And so that's always core for the assignments, but also the discussions that we do in class as well.
I don't have much to add either. Those are both really excellent answers, and they're very similar to the way that I think about pedagogy in the classroom. I think it's really important that students feel safe enough to take risks, and that if we, respond to those risks in ways that help guide them to think about, why they believe what they believe, how they know what they know, that's a really powerful tool that you can use. One of the things I did want to add was I think about pedagogy both as part of the classroom and part of sort of my work in the environmental sector, but there's a major difference between sort of teaching in the environmental sector, or teaching in a classroom, and developing a pedagogy for people who are deterritorialized, so they're not sort of in the same place you are, that you don't have to have their attention, so they're not a captive audience. And you can't build a sustained engagement with them. And so I tried out a bunch of different things in different situations to try to turn things into teaching moments. And one of my favorite ones to bring up, Caroline probably knows this story, is that I once got a call from a very irate oil worker who wanted to threaten me at work and threaten the organization, and was just very generally upset. And was screaming on the phone. And one of the things that I said was, okay, what do you want to get out of this phone call? How can I actually help you? And there was just complete stunned silence for about like a minute, and then just screaming. So that didn't work. But I'm hoping, sometimes when you're talking to people, what doesn't work in the moment sort of sticks with them. Because I was being accused of being in the 1%, and I was like, I don't know who you think you're talking to, but I actually am literally working in like a former nun's quarters, like it's a closet, and I am the only person here, and I'm not making a lot of money off of fighting for environmental protection. So there are a lot of sort of misconceptions that you can sort of try to correct in the moment and just hope that it sticks. Or that it comes back at some point. So I kind of see my pedagogy as being both in and out of the classroom, a process of attempting to instill some questions, and then just hoping that sooner or later those questions will take root and grow into something that I can't see. And so I think it's a way of projecting into the future with hope. A practice of pedagogical hope.
Thank you all for those answers. Do we have any other questions for the panelists? It is like 10 to 3 EST. Oh yes, go ahead.
Just a quick announcement, if you allow me. Maybe Caroline already seen it. We have launched a new journal, multidisciplinary journal of Posthumanism. I think these pedagogical discussions will be an excellent fit for the journal. If you consider anything to publish, we can be in contact. Also, if you want to engage more with the journal, I would love to chat with you. Okay. Thank you for organizing this event today.
Thank you for the announcement. That's exciting. If anyone had any quick final comments for the speakers, now's your time. Just unmute and go for it.
I'll just start with, I guess, end with one final comment. I just wanted to, yeah, to build on the idea of hope. So teaching in the environmental area and now climate justice area, people see the reports that are coming, IPCC, like it's not looking good. And so, but you can't let people just sort of wallow there. Like you gotta, so I like that idea of pedagogies of hope, because like I try to like always make sure that there's hope. Like actually in a lot of our stories, when there's a creation, a destruction, and a recreation, like the utmost principle is you always leave people with hope. Like there always has to be some hope, some way to move forward, some way to be able to support life. And that sometimes can be extraordinarily challenging. But I do think it's important in whatever kind of way that makes sense. Like there's something that you can do, maybe there's broader movements that you could be part of. But I think that this, I really like that term. I don't know if it's if I Google it and then there's going to be like 57 books that come up, but I like that idea. And I never really thought about like calling it that, but I think that's what it is. And I think that's what we have to do in some of the writing that we do, because I find that the thing about academics, particularly in the area of Indigenous environmental justice, we're really good at defining problems and diagnosing them. We could be better at solutions, like, and not like the solution, but a lot of things that people, multifaceted things that people could do at different levels. But that hope has to be there, because I think it's an unfair burden that we're putting on, or my generation is putting on the next generation. And there has to be that hope. So yeah, I like that pedagogies of hope kind of idea. I'll just end with that, because I just was very struck by that, and say it's a very important thing for us to think about in the privileged roles that we all enjoy being in the academy, whoever we are. So yeah, thank you for putting the panel together. But I'll end with that.
Thank you. Any other final comments from the speakers that you'd like to make? That's okay. I think we might just call it there, because it is a Friday afternoon at 3 EST, and Zoom is exhausting, as everyone has found out by now, but this was really energizing despite the toll of Zoom calls. And I have so much to think about going into this weekend. So thank you to our 3 speakers for all that you brought. This is a recording, in case you didn't see the little red thing at the top. So it will be posted once I figure out how to on the EHN Facebook. And if you're interested in future EHN events, you can contact the Facebook page or the Twitter to get added to an email list for our future events. I don't know if you wanted to add anything else, Alexandra. Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for coming out, and thank you to our speakers for all that you shared. I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend.
Thanks everyone for your time and your engagement. This was such a pleasure.
Yeah. Bye everyone. Have a good weekend. Enjoy the
Bye.
nice weather right now. Bye.
Yes, hope you get outside.
Bye. Thank you so much.